I'm going to talk for about half an hour and then there'll be plenty of time for discussion, and hopefully I think there are a number of people in the audience who know a lot more than I do, so and I think many of these issues are quite challenging issues, so I'd be really interested to hear your engagement as well as the sort of perspective that I'm bringing as a researcher, and I'm very much a researcher. I always say that I'm not an activist, but obviously or a company, but a lot of the research I do hopefully informs those who are directly engaged as practitioners in one way or another. I should just say before I start that a lot of, as well as the fact that I'm now on a Lever Human Fellowships, writing a lot of my research up, trying to bring it all together and look at what's changed over the last 10 or 15 years, particularly with a gender focus. But also what I'm going to talk about builds on a lot of research that we did in a big program called the Capturing the Gains program, which I coordinated with Professor Gary Gireffi at Duke University. So if you're interested in that, I'm not going to discuss that in any detail, but if you're interested, there are some leaflets and I'll put them at the front, and please do collect one at the end. So basically the three things, or the four things that I want to discuss is this issue of really, and this is what I'm working on, I'm still grappling with, because I think these are complex issues, but really my focus is on global value chains, the way in which production, distribution and consumption are coordinated and don't just happen independently through free markets, as much of conventional economics might argue they do. But what I really want to argue is that with the rise of major retailers, and particularly supermarkets, multiples as they're also called, in the trade, with the rise of multiples and retailers, there's actually been a major gender transformation in the way food is produced, distributed, bought, retailed and consumed. And I did tell Tim earlier that what first, I mean, I've always had a very strong interest in gender issues, and I knew that a lot of women were working in the value chains of major retailers. But what really first alerted me to the fact that global value chains themselves, the commercial dimension of global value chains, was a gender issue was a number of years ago now, probably about 8-9 years ago, and I was interviewing a category manager of a supermarket as part of a research project, and he mentioned gender. So I said, and an interest in gender. So I said, why are you interested in gender? And he said, well, in my team we have a specialist, someone who specialises in gender issues. So I said, why is that? So he said, well, who do you think our consumers are? So that got me thinking, and so then from then on I've been kind of borrowing much more. So what I'm really trying to do now is bring together the better understanding of the commercial dynamics and the gender dynamics and how they interact, rather than simply looking at sort of women as a important but some way sort of separate category that you think about in a philanthropic way or a social way. Really arguing gender is a central element in food value chains. So I'm going to look at a little bit just of sort of background on this, then I want to look at the actual analysis that I'm working on currently. And then we're framing it, or we're capturing the gains, and I'm continuing this, framing it within a framework of economic and social upgrading and downgrading, and I want to look at the gender dimensions of those and give some examples. All of this is work in progress, and then think a little bit about how to promote greater gender equity and women's empowerment, economic especially, and social empowerment within value chains. So first, just a little bit of key kind of background issues, and this is this issue of who do you think our consumers are. And if you think about the consumer node, there are major changes that are going on, and what I'm going to discuss doesn't just relate now to the global north, but also increasingly to the global south. Not only the BRICS, the big new emerging economies, but also smaller countries, developing countries, where you've got this very rapid changes taking place in terms of consumer markets and increasing role of supermarkets. But just to keep it short, the key thing that we've seen is a big change in the role of women, particularly in the labour force. And there's a lot of studies that I just draw on, I don't study this specifically, but that have looked at increasing female labour participation. But also a number of studies thinking through what are the implications, and a lot of feminist analysis has looked at that in terms of women juggling different roles. Now obviously in juggling different roles, supermarkets have increasingly come to play a major role, because women, when they work and they're maintaining a household, are increasingly dependent on supermarkets as one-stop shop. You don't have to go every single day, you only need to go once a week, and very much for accessing prepared food, so that reduces the amount of work that you have to do in the household. So traditional roles played by women are very much changing. But women are also a key consumer group, not just because they're 70+% of consumers certainly in the UK and the US. And I can give you, there's a paper behind this, by the way, so if you're interested I can send you that paper. It's not quite out yet, but it'll be published very shortly by the European University Institute, and that has the actual sources and data. But they're also a key consumer group in terms of what they buy and what their interests are. So just as an example, looking at fair trade, a survey that was done, I think it was by Keynote, showed that 23% of women interviewed in the survey were interested in fair trade and wanted to ensure that the products they bought were ethically sourced in some way, relative to 18% of men. So women clearly have a kind of a consciousness about what they buy. They're not just simply consumers. And I've done some work as well on child labour. And when you go and buy a product and you spend a large amount of money on it, you don't, to feed to your own children, you don't want to know that another child has suffered in its production. So I think there's an increasing role of women as consumers, but women as consumers with incomes in their own right, who are therefore independent incomes and therefore able to make decisions. In the producer node of value chains, I haven't gone into the detail of a value chain yet, I will in a minute. We also know, and we've known for a long time, and a lot of my research has been on this, and I'll cite data from my own case studies, but there are many more. Just to give you an example, because in industry the data is more easily accessible. It's much more difficult to get data in the supply chains on agri-food. But in export processing zones, it's estimated that there are over 40 million workers, 80% of them are women. And those feed directly into value chains. So for the manufacturing, we've got good data. What we don't have is good data for food. We've got case study data, and I am certainly been trying to aggregate and get better access. So these are just some examples. South African fruit, there are about 400,000 wage workers now, and it's estimated, these are industry figures, 53% of them are women, and there are indirect workers and dependents, if you take everybody together, around 2 million. And Kenyan flowers, 220, flowers and vegetables, fresh vegetables, 220,000 smallholders, 90,000 wage workers. It's estimated approximately 75% of those are women. West African cocoa, and I'm doing a lot of work on cocoa at the moment, 1.5 million smallholders. This all feeds through to the chocolate that you probably ate earlier today. 25% of farmers, it's estimated, are women. And this is a very recent estimate, but it's now being cited a number of times. About 45% of work undertaken on cocoa farms is done by women, but it's usually unpaid female labour, and this is a big issue in agri-food chains and why it's so often so difficult to get data. Now there are some major opportunities for women. This is actually in many ways very progressive, and I need to be a bit careful of the time, but I mean very early on in my own research I was interviewing women fruit workers in Chile, working for a large multinational, and I said, well, isn't it terrible you're working these long, this was about 10 years ago, you're working these long hours, these exploitative conditions. And one of them, very strong woman, turned around to me and she said, we have always worked hard, now we're being paid for it. And I think that really just turned my thinking that you've really got to think through both the opportunities as well as the challenges. In the same fruit chain, though, took me a while to calculate it, they were getting a very small percentage of the actual final value of what was being produced. And when such large amounts are being produced, then why should they not be getting more? Yes.
That figure of 45% unpaid, is that voluntary or is it the mixed positive?
No, this is smallholder farming, so this will be largely unpaid family labour. And I'm going to come back to it in a bit as one of the examples. So this is unpaid family labour, so this will be completely voluntary. Well, some might not be, but much of it will be. Okay, so that's just to, but there are major challenges, and I think it's the challenges that we also need to be thinking about, because these are women who are working in agri-food chains that feed into an increasingly globalised food system in which billions of profits are made every year. So therefore, and I will argue that they are a critical part of this food system, but that they're unrecognised and not, or insufficiently recognised and insufficiently supported, given the role that I will argue that they play. I'll come to that in a bit. On the other side of the coin, another big change that we've seen is the rise of global retailers. And I think in this audience I don't need to dwell for too long on this, and originally, many moons ago, I was trained in economics, and I was trained very much to think about markets. Everything goes through free markets. Producers produce, the prices change, the buyers or the traders come in, then they negotiate, and then it goes to the next stage of the next market, and so trade carries on. Not anymore. The large global retailers, these are just the top three, Walmart, Carrefour and Tesco. These are the largest global retailers in the world of all retail, and of the three of them they are supermarkets. As supermarkets they are multiples. They sell both food primarily, but also very importantly in Walmart's case probably a larger amount non-food, manufactured products, etc. And my research is on retail, so that's why I cross over food and non-food. And just to give you an example of the size, Walmart is now one of the largest companies in the world. It moves up and down slightly. Its gross revenue is greater than the GNP of 120 countries. It's about the equivalent of Switzerland. When you hear about trade negotiations, I would say, well, was Walmart at the table? No. Well, why not, if other countries were there which have a smaller GNP than their gross revenue? And it's estimated that it was China's 8th largest trading partner at this point in time. In fact, I've seen data since that it was 7th, but this relates to these data which come from 2010. Now, the key of all of this is that these companies do not work through free markets. They work through highly coordinated global value chains. Walmart doesn't go out into the free market on a Monday morning and hope that they might be able to find what they need to put on the shelves the following week, and that maybe they could haggle over the price and see if they could get it right. They pre-program, they coordinate, they plan 6 to 9 months ahead, they discuss with suppliers. Suppliers are given explicit instructions right the way down to the detail of what a grape or a berry or an apple should look like in terms of size, colour, etc., etc. They track the whole of the distribution system going through to their final shops. Walmart owns a satellite which it operates from Bentonville. It sources roughly, well, all three of them source around 40,000 products, so there are up to 40,000 products that you can buy, sourced from 70 to 80 countries. So this isn't done just through the magic of free markets. This is done in a very coordinated way and a planned way. And this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about global value chains. And the world, the economic world, is just waking up to this notion of a value chain, that things don't just work through free markets, as the economists had assumed, and conventional economics is still built on. And the OECD, WTO and UNCTAD are now working together to try and estimate how much of trade goes through value chains. They have a slightly different ways of calculating. OECD, WTO estimates around 60% using a particular method. UNCTAD estimates it's around 80% of world trade now goes through these coordinated value chains, not through traditional free markets. So what is a value chain? And this is just a very, very simplified value chain, and I want to just talk it through briefly, and then just think what the gender dimension of the value chain is. And essentially what value chain analysis does is to analyse the linkages in all the stages from production, this is very simplified, but from initial inputs through production, through packing and processing, through distribution, through retail to the final consumer. And to think of those as interlinked processes, and particularly in a context where the lead firms, the big brands, this could be the food brands, and or the supermarkets. I'm more focused at this point in time on the retailers, but they both have a critical role to play, and where they have an enormous ability now to govern what happens in their supply chains. So this example I gave of Walmart coordinating pre-programming, this is all part of their governance. And another key aspect of their governance, they are consumer focused, and they work backwards. So they start with what the consumer needs, how in order to position themselves, and then they work backwards in terms of trying to supply it. And the key focus of supermarkets is, and of most of these lead firms, is to attain the best quality possible in the different consumer market segments. So if you think you go into your Tesco, you've got your Tesco Finest and your Tesco Value range, with the appropriate price point at each of those different consumer segments, all sold within one store, so that you will go and buy everything in that one store and then buy everything else at the same time that you need. So they play a key role, and of course, and again I'm not going to go into it, standards have become an increasingly important way in which they coordinate and govern those value chains. So in food, the big standards, the Global Gap, HACCP, there's the BRC standard, etc., etc. There are also another range of social standards, but I'll go into those in a bit more detail in a minute. And then they liaise back both with the traders and the distribution. So you've got the big traders in there, such as Cargill, etc., and who feed into the manufacturers and ultimately through to the retailers. And then you've got in the processing and packing, especially in the developing countries, but this is also in the UK and in Europe, again a high level of coordination, high levels of specifications, and that goes right the way through to production. Now if we think in this kind of generic value chain, and a lot of value chain analysis focuses on the firm linkages, what I'm really interested in as well is what are the linkages through to workers and smallholders? What is the gender implications? So in a very simplified form, I think a lot of the analysis is showing increasingly that at the production level, both smallholder, and you can't see it very clearly here, I had coloured it, but I haven't coloured it enough. So the smallholders' labour are kind of a pale purple, which is a mix of male and female. Many people think of smallholder farming as being primarily male, because men are the landowners. But increasingly we're seeing that it's women who do much of the work. So the World Bank and FAO now estimate that 60 to 70% of actual smallholder farm production, the actual work in Africa, is done by women. Labour in the processing and packing, so this is now moving on to the next stage, which is more commercialised. That, in virtually all the studies I've looked at, with a few exceptions, is primarily female, and I'll give you some examples of that later. There are some exceptions, particularly as you become into the more manufactured high-tech side, it tends to get then more male, but certainly in the labour-intensive it's primarily female. Traders and distributors, can't remember which colour that is. That blue? No, it couldn't be. Primarily male. That is changing. There are shifts, and you're seeing increasingly more agronomists, women coming through as agronomists, etc., who are linked into some of the companies who are in that segment. But certainly there's a very strong male dominance there. In the brands and retail, particularly in the retail, then it comes back to a purple. Think of it going in any supermarket, it's primarily women who are working in the supermarkets. As you go on back, 10 or 15 years ago, most of the buyers were all men, weren't they? They're women now. Watch them as well. They can be the suppliers also, yeah, they can be pretty sharp on their feet. and you'll hear that from suppliers. And then you come through to consumers, customers, and that is, as I've already said, 70% female. Now, what's interesting in these consumer-focused supply chains, value chains, is that increasingly, traditionally in traditional markets, it was the specific country in which any of these activities took place that any kind of regulation or protection, labour protection, support, extension services for smallholders, etc., took place. But with structural adjustment, liberalisation during the 1980s and the rapid growth of these very large global value chains, much of that withered or has diminished. And increasingly, civil society, particularly global union federations and non-government NGOs, non-government organisations, have played an increasingly important role in developing advocacy campaigns in order to enhance support. And those advocacy campaigns, and I'll mention it, are increasingly, or many of them are focused on gender issues. Just thinking through a value chain from a gender perspective, and I can only kind of briefly touch on this, but this is more of the analytical side. What I'm really looking at is the way in which the traditional gender division of labour is being, is evolving and changing, not just through the advance of supermarkets and global retail, but that is part of this process of change in the gender division of labour. So if we think in very simple terms that a classic gender division of labour, traditional gender division of labour in many countries, and this still certainly prevails in many cultural norms, is that men do most of the productive, in inverted commas, waged work or entrepreneurial work. They are the farm owner, they are the manager or the firm owner, or they are the waged worker. And women primarily do the unwaged work, what's called reproductive work in the household. Bearing children, obviously, women clearly for biological reasons do that, but also all the care of children, cooking, cleaning, household labour, care of older relatives, etc. So that's a sort of traditional gender division of labour which has prevailed in many, many societies. But increasingly what I'm arguing is that as economies develop and advance, as women are becoming more engaged in the workforce, and as some argue we're moving from a single earner household model to a dual earner household model where both men and women work, so the supermarkets are coming into the breach, and other retailers, and effectively commercialising much of the reproductive labour that was traditionally done by women. So now in supermarkets you can buy ready-made meals, processed food, your carrots are now washed and chopped for you very nicely. Don't buy them, they're about 4 times than if you bought the carrot, the full carrot, and chopped it yourself, and by the time you've opened the bag you could have done the same thing. But anyway, I won't go into all of that. But you can see this process, and also not just in food, but I mean traditionally my grandmother made clothes, my mother mended clothes to keep them going. I now just go and buy ready-made garments, and my children will now buy ready-made garments that they chuck away and buy the next one because the fashion's changed tomorrow. So you can see this process of the commercialisation of what was traditionally done by women, and that supermarkets have played a key role. But if we think about that in the way value chains operate and the way value chains work, what I'm arguing is that there are 3 aspects here in the way value chains create value. Firstly, there is value creation. How is value created in the first place? Secondly, there is the issue of the value capture along the value chain. Who captures what value at what point? And that underpins the issue of value distribution. And again, just keeping it fairly quick and simple, as the data showed, women's work is women are increasingly playing a role in value creation, particularly in the production and the packing and the processing. But what I want to argue is that women's skills are critical to the quality which is being added in that value creation process. But these are often, women's employment is in societies which have traditionally and still do remunerate and under-recognise women's work, and therefore their remuneration for those skills and that quality is not returned back to women, but is largely passed on in the form of economic rents, which is then captured further along the value chain. So if we go back one, the basic argument is that much of the value creation is happening here. Women play a critical role in the creation of quality products, and they're often employed specifically because of their social skills, and as Diane Elson and others have long argued, those social skills those skills are socially acquired. They're not remunerated for those skills, certainly not proportionately to those skills, and that allows the big retailers to charge, particularly at the higher price points, a much higher price point and capture the value at this end of the chain. And so just to give you some examples, and again, very difficult to get data for this. They don't share the data very easily. We'll go into that sometime, but anyway, these are actual estimates that come from various studies. But a chocolate bar, it's estimated that on a standard chocolate bar, approximately 3% of what goes of the final retail price goes back to the farmers who produce the cocoa in the first place. Don't forget there are issues with chocolate bars because you also usually have milk and sugar and other inputs into them. And fresh grapes, 9 to 13%, and approximately 42% of the final price goes through to the retailer. There are many more studies. I couldn't find the one for flowers, and I do have it somewhere. So this is just a kind of way, a discussion or a way of looking at value capture. I will say that what this is telling you is only the value, the final retail price and the way it's distributed. It's not taking into account, there are a lot of issues around how you calculate value capture. It's not taking into account the levels of investment, et cetera, that will take place at different segments of the chain. And the retailers will be, quite rightly, fast to tell you that that is also an issue. But it does show you there are certainly very big differences in terms of who captures the values at what point. And this issue of value capture and value distribution effectively, and especially many of the conditions that those who are at the base of the chain face, has become an increasing issue for civil society advocacy and campaigns. And this is just a selection, and I'm worried that there'll be people here, and I could have easily included your logo and I didn't. It's just otherwise you would have had a smattering of logos. But just to give you some examples of some of the civil society more on the advocacy side, and those themselves engaged directly in certification. So you've got the Ethical Trading Initiative, Fair Labour Association, Fair Trade and UTS. By the way, the ones I selected also all are ones that have some kind of gender focus. There are many more, so some don't have such a gender focus. And then in the middle you've got the International Union of Food Workers, who do a lot of work on these issues. And then you have more of the campaigns that have been going on this side. There's a lot of overlap between them. ActionAid, Oxfam Behind the Brands, and Women Working Worldwide. And if you know anything about Oxfam Behind the Brands, I'll come back to them later. I now classify organisations as to whether they, in food, because the Behind the Brands had a major focus on rank companies by their gender focus and their gender, the amount of support they gave to gender in their supply chains. Companies do not like being named and ranked, so it really got a few of them going. But I now look at everybody as to whether who's suddenly now engaging in gender. Was it before or after the Oxfam Behind the Brands? I do think there are issues in how they calculated, but they based it just on publicly available data and information. But it's certainly got the food companies moving on the issue of gender, which is great. So that's more of the kind of context. And then just to build back into this issue of the analysis, a lot of the actual analysis has been selective case studies. And what I'm really trying to do now is to bring those case studies together more and try and analyse what do the combination of what are we learning out of the case studies? Are they all just interesting case studies in themselves, or do they have something bigger to say? And we're using the concept of economic and social upgrading and downgrading, because what the case studies indicate is that women can gain, definitely gain, and workers and producers can gain from participation in the value chain. But they can also lose, and that this lose out and be disadvantaged by it, and that this varies by case. So what we're really trying to do now is to rank cases where we're looking at economic upgrading is when you move to higher value chain activities, when you could capture more of the value in the value chain. Mainly firms and smallholders will also be involved. And the social upgrading is really defined as, there's a bit of overlap here with smallholders, but whether those who are working in those value chains get better conditions and better rights as a result. And what we're finding, we're slowly going through case studies and looking at in different ways of defining this in order to place them. But in some cases, you get, well, let's start with the best, overall upgrading, which is economic upgrading and social upgrading coming together. So firms moving up the value chain, workers and smallholders in those supply chains are also seeing definite improvements in their conditions and rights. And then at the other opposite end, we've got the worst case scenario, which is overall downgrading. So firms are moving down to lower ranked value chain positions in the value chain. These are the suppliers I'm talking about now. And the workers and smallholders who feed into them are clearly losing out as well. But often you get mixed outcomes. Economic downgrading is going with social upgrading. Not many examples of that, but we do have some. One or two in tourism, and economic upgrading and social downgrading. So the firms are moving up, things are getting better for the suppliers, but it's not feeding through to their workers and could even be getting worse. So what I want to do now is just to go through some of the case studies and give you some examples very briefly. How am I doing time-wise? Okay, so give you some examples from case studies of the different kinds of scenarios that the research we did in capturing the gains and related studies are showing. So the first one is a more positive one, and again I can only be brief, but the full paper has a lot more detail. It is flowers, and it's what I call economic upgrading and partial social upgrading. That caveat of partial is very important, and I'll explain the caveat in a second. And particularly a lot of the research that we were involved in was related to Ugandan and Kenyan flowers, or floriculture I should say, to be more specific. Both Kenya and Uganda have upgraded in the value chain, or certainly some of the suppliers. When I talk about economic upgrading, always remember that it's not all suppliers. It's only some suppliers who are able to economically upgrade. So I'm not necessarily talking about the whole sector in any country. I'm talking about those who are able to move up the value chain itself. Kenya, they did it through not only through stems, but also increasingly not only through cut flowers, but also increasingly through the bouquets, etc. And that's really been an important way of moving up the value chain. If anybody's watching what's going on with Kenya at the moment, there's major issues over the trade agreement, and there's the EU's trying to impose a tariff on that. So I think Fair Trade is running a campaign to oppose that. So do click on that and say, no, you've got to stop this, because it could decimate both the producers and workers in Kenya. Anyway, that's an aside. Uganda did it through moving to cuttings, because they couldn't compete so easily with Kenya, but both in different ways have moved up the value chain. Now, the one thing about flowers, and this is a point that I'm going to come back to later, is there were major campaigns in the 2000s over poor working conditions for flower workers. And those campaigns were led by a number of organisations in Kenya, in Uganda, and in the UK. And those poor conditions included very long working hours, but particularly health and safety issues because of the violation of re-entry periods into greenhouses, with women, especially women, because this can have a harmful effect, being exposed to toxic chemicals, which can have a harmful effect on your reproductive effect or reproductive health. What we've seen in both Kenya and Uganda, for those firms who've economically upgraded, not necessarily all firms, are definite improvements. And those improvements are reflected in a number of things. Firstly, in many of the flour farms in Kenya especially have now joined fair trade. There's a large number, I had the figure and I remember off the top of my head, but a significant number have joined fair trade. I think related to that, as one of the conditions is that they have collective bargaining agreements with the unions. They also now have, not all, but many of the farms that have upgraded and joined fair trade and taken the campaigns very seriously have moved to a large percentage of permanent labour. Roughly 70 to 80% of workers on many farms are now permanent rather than casual, and then just being constantly re-employed. This would, I believe, not just because of the campaigns, but also, and the work of Loni Risgaard and others is showing this, it's also because if for the farms trying to economically upgrade, if you're going to train a group of workers to do this highly sophisticated bouquet, which you could buy in a UK supermarket, you don't want them then to disappear because you've laid them off at the end of the month in order to play a game with the contract in order that, etc., etc. You need to retain their skills. And so therefore the skills and investment you've done is part of the process, and making them permanent is partly the campaigns, but partly also the process of economic and social, economic upgrading. So we would argue that there are both. The one thing that there's no study I've yet seen, and I'm going back to Kenya to follow this through further, is that the real incomes of workers have gone up. In fact, the Risgaard and Gibbons study, which is of 11 leading flour farms, shows that the real income, and an Oxfam study as well done in 2013, real incomes, not nominal wages, but real incomes, taking into account all the increase in food subsidy and food, etc., have gone down. So this is why it's partial social upgrading, whilst there have been improvements on some fronts, not on the value capture front. So that's why I wanted to park that one. The next is the mixed outcomes. So this is much more clearly economic upgrading combined with social downgrading. But again, with some exceptions, and it comes from South African fruit. And again, major supplies through to the UK. So it's with the UK is a major consumer of South African fruit. And you've had major changes in South Africa. I'm not going to go into them in any detail in the fruit sector post-apartheid. Very commercialised on the one hand, but also you've had significant improvements in labour legislation for workers in the fruit sector. And for those workers who are retained on fruit farms as permanent and regular workers, there have clearly been improvements as well. And this is a group of permanent workers. In fact, this is a team, and one of them is a woman, team supervisor. Now also a really good tractor driver, and clear improvements for workers who are in that group. But at the same time, the pressures that the suppliers are under, particularly the pressures coming through from supermarkets on price, quality, the increase of costs that they face in order to meet all the standards they now have to face, etc., has also put them under a lot of pressure. And as a result, there's been a significant increase in the casualisation of labour. So for those workers who've been upgraded in the value chain, things have definitely improved. For those who've been casualised, things have definitely not improved, and for many it's gone the other way. And in fact, it's become a much more complex process, because what suppliers have been trying to do is to get casual labour at a lower wage, and local workers, skilled casual labour, but at a lower wage. And they've had a lot of problems getting that kind of labour, and have been increasingly bringing migrant workers in from other African countries, other parts of South Africa, in order to try and fill that void. And all of this erupted. Some of these are skilled migrant workers. One of the interviewees in one of our studies was a teacher from Zimbabwe. Now, she was there for political reasons, but this was a teacher being employed as a casual worker on a fruit farm in South Africa. Those casual workers around 2012-13 were not being represented. They weren't being covered by they're formally covered by codes of conduct of the supermarkets, etc., being missed out in audits. Their conditions really weren't being looked into. Many were coming through labour brokers who were, well, many of, not all, but many of whom were questionable. They really rose up in 2012-13. And what was interesting was that they took a value chain approach. What they did was to block the main end. They didn't rise up against their individual farmers. They rose up as a group, blocked the N2 and the N1, which meant that all the transport coming through to the Cape Town port was now blocked because you blocked the N1 and the N2, which effectively closed off the fruit value chain for South Africa at the beginning and just going into the main fruit period where their exports were coming through to Europe. And the demand wasn't against the individual employers, it was against the government to raise the minimum wage, and arguing that they weren't being represented as casual workers in those negotiations. So you could see those tensions really erupting. So this was an example of economic upgrading and social downgrading. And then finally, very quickly, I could go into any of these for hours. Cocoa, this especially, I've only just come back from Ghana, is economic and social downgrading. So very briefly, again, you've had all the way through from structural adjustment really hit African countries in terms of liberalisation of the marketing boards, and that happened in cocoa with a partial exception in Ghana. And the small-scale farmers, I've already given you 1.4 million roughly in West Africa alone, were heavily exposed to the free market. But that happened at a time when you also got enormous consolidation amongst the big traders, cocoa traders, the big manufacturers of chocolate, and the big retailers. And that very, very disbalanced value chain really led to an enormous amount of value capture from the cocoa farmers going through to the final retailers, processors, manufacturers and retailers of chocolate. And it's reflected, and I haven't got, like any of you, you can see it if you want to see the paper, in long term during the 1980s into the 1990s, a secular decline in cocoa prices. The amount of value that was captured by cocoa producing countries declined significantly during that period, and that was an estimate by the World Bank. And again, I haven't got this data, I should have written it down, but a significant decline in the amount that went back to those countries. No investment, lack of extension services, those were largely disbanded under structural adjustment, lack of support, declining incomes. A big study we did in Ghana showed that many cocoa farmers were living well below the poverty line of $1 a day, even taking into account other access to other forms of income. Increasingly, they had mobile phones. The younger ones knew what the alternatives were elsewhere and were getting out of cocoa. So you had a major problem of declining productivity as a result, declining communities, lack of investment in communities, and an exit, especially by the youth, the younger, more productive farmers. Migrant farmers, and especially women, were coming in to fill the void. But just about 2 or 3 years ago, Amajaro, which is a major cocoa trader, did an estimate with the massive growth in chocolate demand in China and India, which is about 10% per annum in both of those countries. That's 2.4 billion consumers. So that's a lot of chocolate being eaten. That with declining productivity as a result of economic and social downgrading in the cocoa sector, you had serious problems with productivity, serious problems with expanding output. And Amajaro predicted that by 2020 there would be nearly a 1 million tonne shortage of cocoa given predicted future demand for chocolate. That sent a shockwave through the chocolate industry. And as a result of that shockwave, and then spurred, I think, by Oxfam's Behind the Brands campaign, which focused specifically in a very high-profile way on the gender dimension of chocolate producers, on gender in cocoa. And so now although you've had a long period of economic and social downgrading, there are now an enormous number of initiatives going into trying to support cocoa farming, and the most recent of those is the Cocoa Action Plan, which was launched by the World Cocoa Foundation, which brings all the chocolate companies together, and they have included gender as one of the strands, if you like, that they think needs to be addressed to sustain the future of chocolate in the future. So you can see that turnaround is now happening, but it took, I think, ultimately the Amajaro prediction to really send the shockwave, along with campaigns. Many others were involved in those campaigns as well, by the way, but Oxfam specifically named the companies, but that really focused their attention. So just to bring this all together, I think essentially what the research is showing is that there are a number of pressures towards economic upgrading, but there is also downgrading going on. But the more, I should have had it the other way around really, but anyway, the more suppliers economically upgrade, the more they need to attain a better quality and better skill in the value chain. And in order to do that, increasingly it's women who are being brought in to do many of the activities. So in chocolate, for example, the research we're involved in at the moment shows that although it's often called a male crop, a lot of the key activities done by women are those activities that enhance the quality of cocoa, that gives you that final fine flavour, and if you're a chocoholic like me, that lovely kind of melting feeling in the mouth, which is why it's so addictive. So there are also at the same time, therefore, pressures towards social upgrading, and definitely many women in many sectors, certainly some women in many sectors, benefit from the results of social upgrading in terms of getting better paid employment, having a more independent income, etc., etc. But at the same time, there's this, not only the pressure for higher quality, there's also the pressure for value capture at the other end of the chain. And that puts downward pressure on prices and costs at the base of the chain. And so there's this attempt to try and get the social upgrading at a lower price through different means, particularly by the suppliers who are feeding into the chain. And this tension is playing out around this issue of quality and skills, but it's a highly gendered tension because of the role that women play, both at the consumers and at the producer end. And of the 3 case studies I've shown you, the ones where you've seen the upgrading take place, in all of them, at the end of the day, some form of civil society campaign has played a role in really focusing on the gender issues and trying to support that upgrading process. And what I'm really looking at is to what extent does the upgrading come through the requirement for skill, and definitely some of it does, and to what extent, particularly for, say, the more casualised workers, etc., does it come through the campaigns. Ultimately, I think both of those play a role. Bits that are missing in here, I haven't had time to go, but the bit that's missing is the role of government, and government so far has played too small a role. So just to wind up, how am I doing? Well, I'm just finishing now, sorry, I've gone over a bit. Just to think through what the implications are, really from a strategy standpoint, I think the big focus now has to be on the companies themselves and on the value chains themselves. I do think the supermarkets and retailers still don't fully think through what that gender is something that is of, just turn it back a minute. This issue of the resilience of their supply chains is becoming something that's really preoccupying many retailers and food manufacturers. And part of that is just simply because of the rise of China and India and alternative markets. So they're really facing a lot more competition now than they used to for quality product. Certainly at a price that they used to be able to get it at. I don't think the supermarkets and the retailers yet fully understand the gender issues in their own supply chain. They tend to rely on the processors and the big manufacturers to do this for them. With some exceptions, some retailers don't, but many do. Certainly in the food industry, the sections that I've looked at, and particularly cocoa, to a lesser extent tea and coffee, The traders and the manufacturers are beginning to get it, that gender is something that they ought to be looking at. They're not getting it how they should be looking at it, and they're not getting what the implications potentially are, but they're beginning to recognise it. And certainly I think some of the NGO campaigns has helped to galvanise that recognition. Government really has to be more involved. In many of the countries where these value chains or the sourcing takes place, there are government strategies in place to support women, to regulate working conditions, etc., etc. And yet in the export sectors, they just seem to, it's almost like a kind of a veil comes down. Oh, well, that's the private sector, we'll leave that to them. And anyway, there are these codes of conduct and stuff, we'll let them deal with it. Well, no, if you're going to promote gender equity, it has to be both done through the value chain and it has to be done in the country, because it's those gendered social norms that are also feeding, if you like, some of that the value capture and the gender inequity that takes place along the value chain. But also the donors and the multilateral organisations really have to get their act together on this. And they're so focused on things like aid for trade, it's all efficiency and markets. Well, the cocoa example is a perfect example. You can get perfectly efficient markets, you're just going to have no one feeding into it. And even though cocoa prices have gone up, it's quite clear that farmers are not coming back in sufficient numbers and increasing productivity in sufficient numbers to meet this gap in demand. I'll never forget once in Ghana, when I was doing research, they told me about, because to improve quality of cocoa, we're doing all this training and we're putting so much resources into it. And I said, so who are you training? We're training the farmers. So who's the farmer? The farm owner. And then, of course, we did the research. Who actually does the work? It's women, often as unpaid family labour. They were not getting the training. So they're training the wrong people. So they're beginning to see it. But if you don't think it all the way through. And then finally, researchers. And I think for food researchers, Tim Lang and colleagues, I think this is probably an exception in this room. But I think too often, you might support me a bit on this, is too many of the agroeconomists still think in this market framework, making markets work for. It's all down to getting the product out and getting the price right, without thinking through the value chain. Who are all the different segments and how to attain what they want in ways that helps you to capture value at your end, and that is highly gendered. And I think researchers have an important role in showing that up. So I'll stop there. Sorry, and I've gone way over.
Stephanie, that's really fantastic. That was an incredibly elegant account of global value chain analysis and how the social dimensions cut across it. But the three examples just completely brought it to life. And this is the leaflet that Stephanie's brought. This is Capturing the Gains, this project jointly done by Manchester and Duke, with lots of other partners as well. So it's and the papers you've referred to are on that website, aren't they?
Yeah.
I nearly said it earlier, but I will now say it, that we held the first meeting of the food research collaboration here in the university, here at City, where we had 36 or something, 30 plus very large NGOs working in Britain, including some of the ones you mentioned, where we were wanting to hear what did civil society of UK food-related civil society, what did they want to know from academics? What was their agenda? And one of the things that came out loud and strong was where the money goes. One is that the second highest thing, Mary, correct me if I'm wrong, was who makes the money, literally. And here we were getting an example. And this were people like conservation organisations. They know that land use, even in Britain, let alone internationally, won't be sorted and protected unless we have a better understanding of the sort of power relations you're referring to. Let me give you just the one statistics. In Britain, of 190 billion pounds the British spend on food and drink, soft drink, not alcohol, 9.6 billion goes to farmers. It's 4.3% goes to farmers. So what Stephanie was describing there is not actually, not that you were saying this, is not a just an international problem, it's also a national problem. This is immense.
It'd be good to get that data actually,
I
because
can
it's
give you it.
really
It's
good.
DEFRA's own data.
Oh,
I
wow.
quote it all
Brilliant.
the time. And DEFRA's
Discuss
chief
it.
statistician writes to me and said, how dare you say this? He never writes back when I say, well, it's your figures. Here it is, page 22. You know, it's extraordinary. This is just taken for granted that the money is made elsewhere. It's quite remarkable. Okay, now questions. What do you want to ask, and would you just say who you are and then leap in? So, comments, over to you. Thoughts? Can you say who you are?
Yes, hi, I'm Daphne Singer from ActionAid.
Okay.
Thank you for the
Oh
presentation.
yeah, you go.
Susan,
I know, I'm getting very worried.
Bottom right, you're probably going to be
I saw
completely
I saw the list of who. I
Why
saw the
weren't
list
we
of
in
who
the
was coming
centre?
after. Oh no, that was deliberate. The right were the campaigners and the left with the advocacy.
okay.
Yeah.
Very
It should have been the other way
Very
around,
good.
really.
Okay, your
Went
question.
with the value chain.
No, I really enjoyed your presentation. It was really compelling. I wanted to ask about you talked about the change in the gender division of labour and a shift to a dual earner household. And you talked about that in terms of like what the implications were on the retail side. But I wondered about how that change in the gender division labour is exploited in the social downgrade and the casualisation of labour. Did you find in your
Yeah.
research that there's
Yeah.
you know that's exploited in that women who are trying to juggle two roles and earn and looking for flexibility so they can care for their families, that's sort of exploited in order to feed that
Yeah.
value capture that you talked about. And then,
Do you want to? That's an enormous question.
sorry, that's a big one.
As someone
Yeah.
who receives these things, do you want to deal with that first? Or
Yeah, or do you want to do
have
both
Do you want to do
questions
both,
and then
you
maybe
can-
I'll just
The
answer and then
The
come
other one
back?
is just
yeah.
about the changing picture as well. It's
Yeah.
about changes in the value chain with more, as you mentioned, more women in the processing side, the food processing side, and whether that changes women in food production from a rural picture to an urban picture, and whether you've
Yeah,
seen that.
yeah. Okay, yeah,
Two
two.
questions
Right,
then.
okay. So what have we got? A day? No.
Sorry.
No. Really important questions. I think firstly on this issue of casualisation, I mean, I am a researcher, so I'm really trying to find out what's going on. Now, I know if you work in the NGO world, you're campaigners. So, I mean, by definition, you have to focus on certain issues, and those tend to be the bad issues because those are the best issues to campaign on. You don't campaign against, you know, everything being perfect, so because you've achieved that one. So, now traditionally, and I'm still working on this, by the way. I'm actually going to spend 3 or 4 months next year in Africa and just specifically really digging down into some of these. When we've done the research in South Africa, and that's where you've seen that's of those examples where the casual labour issue has got a lot worse. Historically, and it is for reasons around apartheid and gender norms, etc. Men were the permanent workers, and women were the temporary workers or the casual workers, it tended to be, particularly in the Western Cape, it tended to be the Afrikaans who were the permanent workers. So there was also, and black Africans who were in the migrant group that came in and supplemented. So there was a kind of gender and racial division of labour that worked its way through. What I think is interesting, and I really do need to reconfirm this, so it's something I'm looking into, is that when you had the big retrenchments that went around after the end of apartheid, and you got the consolidation of a core labour force, that seems to have benefited both men and women, but those women who were in the core labour force. But that is a smaller group than before, if you see what I mean, in total. And certainly sort of in my own research, for example, I'm in one particular farm I did a lot of research on. Revisited a couple of times. When they made the women part of the core workforce, they also were the ones that did the packing, and that also led to changes in the household, which were unheard of, where men would now be collecting the children, etc., because you finish in the fields earlier than you finish in the pack house. And women working in the pack house, they could get a lot better income than the men could in the fields. because women do get a lot better income if they work in packing and processing than if you do field work. So there are also a lot of tensions arising from that, because in Chile I saw it as well. The men resent that women are now can earn a lot more than them, and they can't get those jobs in the pack house. So there are definite improvements for women, and I think we really, as a researcher, we have to be mindful of that. Now, what I'm not quite so clear on so far is on the casualisation that's gone alongside that. And from what I've seen, but this is only small case studies and I really need to follow up on it, is that the casualisation has affected both men and women. So it's not that it's, because whereas before it used to be all women, it was women or migrant workers who were the casual, and men, particularly coloured men, who, that's not now. And also the ethnic breakdown division is changing. At the end of the day, the farmers want whoever can, in the core workforce of whatever race, ethnicity or gender, they want the workers that can deliver the best quality most efficiently. And that will take precedence over whether it's a woman, where they come from, etc. So I think you're seeing, as a result, pressures in this core workforce that are working against that traditional gender division of labour. The casualised workforce, though, from what I've seen so far, it's both men and women who are then losing out. Obviously, women aren't losing out so much because they weren't regular workers and permanent workers before. And there is a lot as a result of tensions between men and women, and a lot of tensions between the different ethnic groups, and especially with bringing migrant workers in to try and get, as Ben Rogaley calls it, to get the right worker at the right price. I'm a teacher working as a casual worker in South African fruit. That was an exception, but there was a large Zimbabwean migrant labour force being brought in. So I think that we're seeing a complex change. It's not as straightforward, but I think we're seeing a move away from the traditional gender division of labour. On this issue of the rural-urban, yes, definitely. That's leading to some quite major shifts in terms of particularly kind of the what's it called? You do more urban than the sort of semi-urbanised, peri-urban. That's it. Sort of growth of peri-urban areas, and also with that a change in the nature of what agricultural production is. You're not seeing it so much yet in smallholder farming, but I think you're seeing it on smaller scale commercial farming. You're seeing much more of a sort of peri-urban farm workforce that's working in there. On the really large plantations, that's much more of a sort of agro-industry model. So I think you're seeing shifts, but it plays out very differently in different countries, and even in the same product it plays out differently in different locations. And a lot's to do with supply and demand, seasonality, all sorts of other factors.
Sorry, I missed the first question. I have to step out.
Do you want to say who you are?
David Barling from Centre for Food Policy. The context of this question is briefly that I was doing some work on global value chain governance, in relationship to a bid that I was putting in. And I was trying to figure out the role of the state in relationship to this.
Mm-hmm.
And I was interested in the South African economic upgrading example you gave, where you said that the protest was about raising the minimum wage, which obviously is a state responsibility. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how that played out and how did that contribute to the economic upgrading?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And don't forget, this was only 2012 it all broke out, 2013, end of 2013 it rolled on through. It's still kind of simmering a tiny bit, but there was a resolution. They did get an increase in the minimum wage. And it's very interesting. I think that that whole story, because there's a whole issue of the South African state post-apartheid, or government, the ANC government had the GEAR policy, and the GEAR policy essentially was a massive increase in legislation, which was very progressive, especially under pressure from COSATU and from the trade unions. Excellent labour legislation. So at a time when many other countries were disbanding labour legislation, South Africa was implementing it, and gender equity policies, etc., etc. So very, very good on that front. But that was combined with a sort of free market orientation towards the export markets. Of course, it's all anchored as well in a lot of tensions under apartheid itself, but very much to the fruit sector. They disbanded the old Cape Span, if you remember, the Unifruco, which were the export marketing boards, and very much just left the fruit sector to the free market. You know, you go your own way, we're focused on other things. So there's this kind of division between state policy towards on the social and labour side and what was happening on the commercial side. And I think the fruit workers got caught in that division, because although formally legislation is a lot better and it now covers agriculture, which before was largely, not totally, but largely left out of labour legislation, now they were formally covered. Effectively, that legislation was really only being applied to the permanent workers. So there was a vacuum evolving in relation to these casual workers, and the casual workers weren't represented by the trade unions. Trade unions, as our research said, they come on farm, they recruit the permanent workers, they don't even come and attempt to recruit us. Now they have a lot of challenges. Trying to recruit a lot of very mobile casual workers is very hard, so I mean you can see why. The trade unions were on the sectoral determination body, which negotiated the minimum wage, representing the permanent workers, who were mainly and often well over the minimum wage, but no one was representing the casual workers, who effectively were all only, some below, but effectively all were only being paid the minimum wage. But the government didn't really want to know about them. I mean, that was all part of what was going on the commercial side. So there was a real division, and it was very interesting, that protest, and it happened just after the mining protests and a number of miners, the Marikana protests. So it happened at a time of a lot of sensitivity about workers' uprising. But unlike Marikana, where there was a division between the trade unions, but the workers were largely unionised, these were ununionised, largely workers, who really mobilised themselves. Everybody was blaming everyone else for it, but effectively, I think it was a genuine, there's a lot of it. I mean, once it started, many people went and got involved, but it really was a kind of an eruption from the base, largely triggered by rising food prices. They were on a recently negotiated minimum wage. Food prices were rocketing, and they simply couldn't afford to feed themselves, and they just went out on the street.
Did they get the state?
Now, the interesting thing then was the state, because that forced the state to get involved in the value chain issues. And it brought the Department of Trade and Industry and the Department of Agriculture and a number of the Department of Labour to the table to discuss what was going on in the commercial sector and how they could improve conditions for these casual workers. And it created then an environment of discussion between the commercial fruit actors, the governments, the trade unions, but also now these newly emerging representatives, and there was a lot of fight over who they were, real representatives of casual workers. So I think it shifted that state-private sector relationship. Quite how that's played out since they raised the minimum wage. They didn't get the full demand, but they got a lot of it. I'm going to find out, and that is one of the things that really interests me, is how that played out ultimately.
Do you want to come back, Amy? Okay, at the back.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much for the presentation. It was fascinating. I have a question specifically on non-monetary kind of benefits that you've been found in research, and whether you found that fair trade certification guaranteed a consistency in getting more for workers. If you remember these.
Yeah, well, I mean, you'll know because you'll be involved. There's a big difference between the minimum wage and the living wage. And I think quite rightly the NGOs are really now focusing in on the living wage, because in so many of these countries, effectively a lot is how you interpret certification, in the standards. And that doesn't just fair trade, that's everybody. Or it's ethical trading initiatives. Well, they don't certify. But the base code as used by supermarkets, for example, a lot's down to how auditors interpret, but effectively what the auditors do is the certifiers uses the minimum wage. And just so much of the evidence is the minimum wage isn't a living wage. I mean, that's the same in country after country after country. So the NGOs have really focused in on that and are trying to push for a living wage. Of course, it's very complex how you define a living wage and for whom, as again, as you will know. But so the answer in the short is no, not necessarily.
I was referring to non-monetary benefits.
Oh, the non-monetary, that's even, sorry, I thought you said monetary. The non-monetary, and you will probably also know that as the wage goes up, the non-monetary benefits are tending to be withdrawn. And that's affecting permanent workers as well as casual workers in some circumstances. And a lot of that depends on supply and demand conditions as well, because local labour supply and demand can affect it. And I do think this issue of them trying to get the skilled workers is helping to keep some of the monetary and non-monetary benefits up in certain labour market environments. In others, where they think they can get the skilled workers at the lower monetary and non-monetary cost, then it's going down. I'm not, to be honest, I mean, I'm not a major fan of non-monetary remuneration. Non-monetary benefits in terms of proper protection, health, insurance, etc., absolutely critical. But that's
on-field toilets, cleaning.
That's also
basic.
Absolutely critical. There's also a kind of a paternalism that goes with giving all sorts of it's almost a form of a wage, free food, free this, free that. I'm not opposed to that, but at the same time it's used a little bit, I think, often by employers as a sort of paternalist thing which can then be taken away from them, which the monetary is more difficult, it's more transparent and more clear-cut. So, but yes, that is an issue of the withdrawal.
Do you agree with that? You're nodding away. Do you have a line on that?
I was aware of an understudy from SOAS that looked at fair trade versus unfair trade in cocoa and coffee. And their funding was very mixed in terms of both income and non-income conditions and benefits in different farms. And in certain, and as you were saying, for the same product in different locations you find a mixed picture. And in some cases they argued that non-fair trade certified farms were offering better conditions.
I think that very important with that study, as I understand it, is that it was
this is the big
SOAS study, is that it was focused on smallholders.
Yeah.
And I think there is so you really have to differentiate between fair trade certified farms, which are the plantation certified farms, where the labour standard clearly applies and is followed through, and smallholder farms, where I think there's a big grey area about how and whether the labour standard. In smallholder farming as well, and I think the criticism goes way beyond fair trade. I would like to know who precisely, not who doesn't, but who in development studies and rural and peasant studies looks, with a few exceptions, and those at least one or two of them were in the SOAS study, looks at wage labour on smallholder farming. And that's something I've been arguing for a long time. You've got to include that. And so often it's ignored. It's ignored by the donors, it's ignored by the certification organisations, it's ignored by the researchers on the whole, with some obvious exceptions. So, but I do think it's a different issue. You can't generalise when you must differentiate between the two.
That's very good. One at the back, and then Tony, who is from SOAS. So, but I'm sure
Do you
you'll.
want to take SOAS?
No.
Yeah,
'cause
totally.
I think you'll be asking something slightly different, Tony. Yeah. No, you stick to it. Who are you?
Helen McTaggart from Marks and Spencer.
Very good.
You elaborated a little bit on the role of the state, and I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on companies. So I think what you said when you were talking to this slide on promoting gender equity was the supermarkets, retailers, manufacturers, traders are starting to understand that there is an issue which needs to be addressed with gender.
I said with some exceptions.
But don't know what or how they should be addressing that. And I just wondered, it's not an easy question, but if you could just elaborate your thinking on that, and have you seen any good examples?
Good question. Good question.
I mean, obviously I was generalising when I was talking about the retailers, and I think it's very important to remember that there are just as there are different price points within any supermarket, there are also different price points across retailers. So some of the retailers definitely have been much more involved in these issues. No names. But what a coincidence you asked the question. So
you're not bad, so she's the neutral researcher. You're pretty good, so you can tell Mark Barry his career.
So the Ethical Trading Initiative, actually on the Kenyan flour example, when all these campaigns erupted, played a major role in bringing a small group of UK retailers together who visited Kenya, and they played a key role in that process of shift from the poorer conditions. On some farms, I think even on some farms you still then had good conditions, so it was mixed then, but really bringing those farms that were economically upgraded up on the social upgrading as well. And I think those retailers that were involved with the ETI in that visit all played a critical role in that process.
Everyone knows ETI,
the Ethical Trading Initiative. And that process was really driven by gender as well, because a lot of those farm workers were women, and a lot of the NGOs who were driving the campaigns were women-focused, women working worldwide, and a gender-focused, women-focused campaign in Kenya itself. So I think when it galvanises, I think the companies can make a very big difference. And I'm really watching with what's going on in cocoa now, because they really are galvanised. And that Amajaro prediction couldn't have come along at a better time than you've got the two, Oxfam and the Amajaro, and there's me saying, well, actually, I don't believe Amajaro, because actually women are doing a lot of the work. You're just not taking it into consideration. So anyway, on the role of the state, I think we face a much bigger uphill challenge. But at the same time, if you'd asked me that same question a few years ago, I'd have just said, what state on some of these issues? But I mean, the South African example is an example of where the state has been dragged, kicking and screaming really, or dragged from silence into being involved, some kind of engagement. And it was also very interesting to watch that play out in terms of government realising that, because they always blamed the farmers. They said, oh, it's all the farmers. If there are problems, it's all the farmers. And then they realised, well, the farmers are actually in this much bigger supply chain. And if you don't look at the whole supply chain and get all the parts working together, you're not going to get the improvements. So that was a shift. I think on the gender issues, I mean, you've actually in some countries got very, very good gender legislation. South Africa's a perfect example. In some countries, you've had very major improvements. There's still a big disconnect. So I think the state is engaged, but not yet linking it to what's going in the value chains. Equally, I think actually the companies could engage more with the state than they have in the past.
I'm going to push on your behalf.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Because this is really interesting. Who is putting the pressure on the companies? I mean, we sort of were aware of the Oxfam thinking and what was going to come out. I mean, was that specifically targeting the companies? Yes, it was.
Yeah, because they were naming and shaming.
They were naming names.
Christian Aid did it many years ago. Yeah, exactly. The same thing, ranking the supermarkets.
What pressure on companies is there? I mean, what pressure do you feel under? Is it all internal value chain pressures that Stephanie was talking about, or is there anything, you know, the academic in me says here's an occasion where the state and progressive companies might get together, actually. It wouldn't, a minor prediction, I would expect that to start emerging, but I don't know whether that's true. And Tony Allen will probably produce a different analysis. But what is your thinking? Where is the pressure on companies going to come from to help raise the boat?
Well, I think the pressure on companies is more what I went into here, because I don't think the pressure is just coming.
Supply in its own
I
terms.
don't think the pressure is only coming from the campaigns. You see, if it was only coming from the campaigns, stop the campaigns, and it would all go back to square one. And we've definitely not seen that.
Yes.
And Kenya Flowers is an example where we've not seen it. I'm planning to go back to Kenya as well to verify some of this, but so this is still work in progress. But certainly from what I've seen, I think it's an example of where it hasn't gone back. So we have to, well, not, you know, there are still many problems. I'm not saying there aren't problems, but so then we have to look in the supply chain itself and this issue of quality and etc. You don't get those beautiful bouquets and invest in the workers' skills to attain them and then just chuck them out at the end of the week and hope they might come back. And then you've got an order from a company like M&S and oops, the workers have all gone. What do we do with the order? You just don't do it. You've invested. And similarly with child labour, you know, there's a lot of investment that goes into meeting standards, an enormous amount of investment. You don't get Global Gap certified and then ask some kid the age of 7 to go out and do this. You just don't do it. I mean, you'd be crazy to, irrelevant of whether an auditor's going to come and find you out, you would just be crazy to, because you don't make those levels of investment and you need people who are skilled to do it. So I think there are definite commercial and economic pressures. But what's interesting is you've also needed these campaigns to galvanise, and it's when the two go together, I think, is when you see the social upgrading going.
Well, this is David Barling world, as I would call it. Lindy, do you want to come in here? This is sort of global gap versus state versus private regulations. You know? Because the M&Ss of this world, progressive companies, actually aren't able to push the standards up as far as good people inside that. You have internal dynamics. You know, we're saying nice things about you, but there are huge fights going on inside. So this is a messy world.
Yeah, I mean, even in the domestic, you know, UK and EU areas, there you can see that state officials are grappling with how to sort this out, even if it's UK suppliers to
Interesting.
Okay, very good.
the same thing's happening in Europe as well. Where it's a problem for the EU internal market.
We've got two questions, Lindy Sharp and Tony Allen. Tony, you've been very patient. Do you want to leap in? I've introduced you. Tony Allen from SOAS.
Yeah, I also have a King's College identity, but on the assumption that there are three sorts of science, and speaking of scientists here, we've got the modelling scientists, agronomists and economists, and even water scientists, doing modelling and metrics. And then we've got explanatory scientists, such as we have today, and I've moved from the first to the second to some extent. And then there's a third kind of science which we could call activist science, and that's populated by the NGOs. And I would like to be fully paid up NGO type scientists, because they really want to get engaged with, in my view, things that matter. So my question is, if you're in the middle, which I mainly am, but aspire to be an activist scientist, where we try to explain, to what extent should we try at the beginning to understand the politics rather than the economics of society? Because, well, to try to understand them, because I sense that that isn't the starting point in this meeting. I don't know whether it's going to be the starting point of any. But should we then even actually get engaged with the politics? Because food is emotional, food is political, food is livelihood, food. So we're likely to find politics in there.
If you don't know Tony, he's Mr. Water in Africa.
I know of.
This is a famous man. Okay, that's a typical Tony Allen question, small and enormous.
Yeah, that's right.
How are you going to answer that in 1 minute, Steph, before we go to Lindy?
I think there's one thing that, because I would put myself in the B group as well, but obviously the issues that I research are issues that the C group are very interested in. I wouldn't put myself in the A group, although I was originally trained in the A group, but I did leave the A group very early on in my career. And I think what I find fascinating is this issue with global value chains. And because of working with Gary Gireffi, I've been very involved in the process, which, I mean, I originally was trained as an economist, and if you're trained as an economist, you're trained in this modelling world, and you build your model on basis assumptions, and then you ignore everything else, and then you really are just testing how the model works, etc., and tinkering with it, and then it gets even more complicated how you model, etc., and so you carry on, and that world is based on an international economy and on the assumptions of markets in different nation states. And that world predominated particularly in trade. I mean, the WTO, because of working with Gary, I've been invited to a number of meetings over a number of years in sort of in quite big kind of donor agencies and multilateral agencies, and you can really see that Group A dominating. You know, if we can't model it, then we don't do it. We're not interested in it, sort of thing. And they've had a bit of a jolt, that world, and I think it was the financial crisis that jolted them. And that brings us into the explanatory issue, because what really hit them in the financial crisis, it was the shift from the G8 to the G20, effectively. And the G20 brought the BRICS in, and the BRICS just said, look, the kind of world, the kind of trade and the kind of world that you're examining isn't the world our economies are involved in. And it doesn't include jobs. So in a sense, it was a political shift. That itself, I think, was political. And that forced they told the OECD, WTO and UNCTAD to go away and get their act together and find out what was going on with value chains. That has sent, I can tell you, sitting in some of the meetings, sent a shockwave through a group, because you can't, with current data and current information availability, you can't just go and model a value chain. I actually sat in a bigger meeting in the OECD discussing this. They said, well, the data doesn't exist, so we can't do this. So I said, of course the data exists. Do you think Walmart doesn't know what hasn't got the data? It's just they're not going to let you have it. That's a different issue, but it's not that it doesn't exist. So the OECD and WTO and UNCTAD are now really working on how to try and analyse these things. So they're, in a sense, being forced a bit more into the explanatory mode, because I don't think these forward-looking value chains, and I think there's a lot of politics about it. And the companies, when I see them actually operating in different countries, it's quite interesting to watch how they engage politically. I mean, essentially to smooth the path in order to do the sourcing, and increasingly to do the retailing. Don't forget, the big growth economies for supermarket retail are not in the UK, Europe and North America. They're in Asia especially, Latin America, and increasingly Africa. If you look at, follow McKinsey and the big kind of forecasters, and you wouldn't be investing in the UK, you'd be investing in retail in Africa in the future. So, as Walmart now knows, and went and bought into Africa, so they saw it. But a lot of that is then political, how you negotiate that space. That becomes a major political issue.
So that's a legitimate place for us to research.
Well, it's how the world is evolving, and I think as explanatory researchers, that's what we have to be focused on.
You've just told us what they're doing. What are we doing?
Well, so we are explanatory researchers, so we are therefore have to focus in on those issues.
This is a great discussion.
Can I just do a quick follow-up on
And
that?
David's very involved in it as well.
Is the faith in value chains been shaken? Because at least 2 years ago, anyway, a lot of literature, we did this work for UNEP, and they've been pretty sold on value chains as the answer to helping rural poverty, and so are and smallholders, and so are IFPRI and the whole range of other donors.
Oh, IFPRI, IFPRI. So you have to then go through. My concern, though, is that has this recognition that value chain, how do you define a value chain? How do you define the politics and the sociology of a value chain, the social embeddedness of a value chain? My concern is that as the shift has taken place in the last year, all of this was last July 2013, a year ago, that we've now got a lot of the economic modelers who are trying to pull value chain analysis into what they've always done. And I've seen it with some of the consultants in the UK, the development consultants who've traditionally gone for a market approach, are now markets with value chains. And I'm like...
They're trying to inject values into value chains. And there's a
Well,
real
they should
problem.
be in political economy.
Yeah,
anyway.
that's
Yeah.
right. I mean, this is a...
So I think we're in a new territory
Yeah.
here. Some of the donors did get it. So GIZ got it very early on. You go through the ones that did. Some of them did. I don't remember FAO getting it. And I went to a big value chain training session at the FAO when they were trying to inject it. And I just, this was a number of years ago, they didn't. I don't know if they've changed. This wasn't...
They rolled out a software tool for how to work in value chains.
Well, the UN, this big shift has really pushed the UN agencies that hadn't done it before into a value chain mode. But
This conversation, by the way, the reason I reached for this, this is the first, as I said, and a fabulous beginning to this series, or revitalised series. The next one is actually Clive Black, who is probably the leading City of London stockbroker, financial analyst of the retail sector, who is going to be exploring the thing very interesting. Well, it'll be filmed as well.
I will watch that.
Yeah,
I will.
come to it, Steph,
I
or
will
watch
if I
it.
can. I'll
Very
definitely
well.
watch it.
He's a very interesting man,
Yeah.
and he's going to be exploring whether there's sort of the something you hinted at, which is why would you invest in Tesco? Why? Is the supermarket...
Well, in the
era
UK,
over?
I said.
No,
well, then why invest in Tesco?
Why?
Yeah, no, in
Well,
the traditional supermarket
This is
retail
and the
model.
City Food Lecture this year, put on in the City of London, was about that, where the head of Booker, Charlie Wilson, a very smart man,
Yeah,
Tony,
yeah.
very smart
He
man, he
is,
said
yeah.
supermarkets, they're over, don't
Yeah.
invest in. I mean,
It's the model, that model, yeah.
But-
There's a
so
question
there's-
whether or not your Tesco figures are valid.
Yeah.
I know.
Anyway,
I would
we're
have,
going to unplugging. This series is going to carry on, and this theme that Tony Allen there raised about what's the role of academics and what's the role of knowledge is a critical one.
yeah.
Tony typically has picked on it. But Lindy, we're going to give Lindy Sharp. Do you want to say who you are?
I don't know whether this
The
is
last
relevant.
word.
It's just an observation, really. It's when you
Say
talk,
who you are.
I'm Lindy Sharp. I work in the Centre for Food Policy. I'm always interested in these kind of entities of supermarkets as great social organisations in themselves, constituting many individuals. And that's really where my research has been, talking to these individuals. And I wonder, and I can never really put my finger on where, the people, the individuals in those organisations also affect the culture of the organisations and what they don't want to be doing the work of the devil. They don't want to, that's how they want to earn their living. So is there a kind of internal culture in these companies that is also driving towards the social and economic upgrade? At which point in a big multinational does the evil set in? You talk to one individual, they're all lovely. So where is that? Is it in the C-suite?
I think it's very important when we talk about companies that they are not a homogeneous group at all. And clearly, a key factor is also what markets do they appeal to. I mean, if you're Aldi and Lidl, you're promoting, your commercial model is based on low cost, high volume. If you're Waitrose and Marks and Spencer's, you're appealing to a different consumer group who clearly have a different set of, espouse a different set of values anyway. So, and then also I think there's big differences in corporate, I mean, just interviewing over many years, big differences in internal corporate culture. Now, in virtually all the organisations I've interviewed some really great people. Probably without exception, you can find in every company great people. The issue is, to what extent are the great people able to influence the culture of the company itself? And that issue, I'm not a business. I work in international development. I come from the business world, but I really do see those different corporate cultures. And then when you get takeovers, how those corporate cultures then change. Or, and what's even sadder, when you get, or maybe as sad or sadder, when you get a company that's really doing some really great work, then comes under the financial squeeze. And then they have to abandon a lot of the work they do, and some of the key people doing that work get made redundant simply because they're having to cut costs, and you get all of that process going on. I ultimately think the bit that I feel I'm missing, but quite honestly I'm trying to do too much as it is, so I'm over ambitious. The piece of the puzzle that wasn't in that value chain, and I don't see very often, with a few exceptions, is the finance bit at the end. Because I think the finance bit is a major driver of what actually goes on. I don't know if anybody's been watching it, but the BBC Two has just run two weeks on traders. The last one wasn't quite so good, but the first one was fascinating. And you just watch these guys and women, one or two, sitting there, some of them definitely, some quite leading traders, and one very eminent woman that they interviewed. And they just sit there and they're just gambling. And it's as simple as that. So in a highly complex financial world, but that has repercussions. I mean, watching that program, I was thinking, you know, that then affects, they were talking about some companies I've interviewed, just in passing. Oh, the share price of this company went up, or that, oh, well, quickly, we better get, it's gone down, we better, you know, buy it quick because it might go up, and, oh no, that one's on its way down, we're not going to buy that. And actually mentioning companies, I researched the workers in the value chains of those companies, and I was thinking, you don't even want to begin to think about what an action you're doing in 10 split seconds is going to have further down. And I think we need to have a lot more research on that and a lot better understanding. The trouble is the skills to understand gender at one end and to understand financial market at the other are very different skills. And I'm not going to start becoming a financial analyst, but I would love to be a fly on the wall, or certainly listen in to the talk, because...
Well, that was the demand. That's why I said, and I don't apologise for it, when we held this meeting here with NGOs saying, what do you want to know from academics?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was a really, really good and smart set of questions they were saying. They want to know how this world is put. Well, you put it, both of you were putting it exactly that. You know, how does it, and where are the leverage points? You know? I wrote down, in case there were no questions, some hope. One of the things that but we won't ask you this, okay, but I'm just flagging. You know, where is this, the neoliberal model of information and labels? Where is this? You know, as the great Felicity Lawrence put in her book, where is it on the label? It's not on the label. This is not on the label. You don't get the information. Even ETI, there's no label saying ETI. Fair trade is sort of a version, you know, of attempting to do it, but is problematic. It doesn't necessarily capture the whole thing. And so, I mean, this is a very, very live question that indeed, bless their cotton socks, Oxfam rightly beginning to think, you know, twice rebuffed, should it now start looking internally, not just the global value chains, but the more Europeanised one. I think that debate is going to become very important.
Be interesting.
Is there any difference between the global, the European, or the British? You know, anyone who's read the Chris Elliott horse meat inquiry, you and I were talking about it earlier. I mean, wow, this is what comes out of it. What's the difference? Whether Africa is African meat or what? Anyway, there is lots of us to talk. I think we should thank Stephanie enormously.
Thank you for those nice questions.